Inflation or deflation, how you can predict the future. And when I'm talking about the future, I'm talking about the dollar, stocks, bonds, gold, real estate. Pretty much everything goes back to answering the question, is the future inflationary or is it deflationary? This is part 2 in a little mini series, so we're going to start right off with step number 3. Understanding IOUs, more specifically, the Fed's IOUs or liabilities versus the banking system's IOUs and liabilities. In the first video we did in this series, part 1, we discussed if bank reserves are actual spendable cash. Are they fungible? When the primary dealer banks go to the government to buy their treasuries at auction, are they using bank reserves to do so? There was a mix of opinion. We had Brent Johnson and Steve, the Bond King, Van Meter on one side. Then we had Luke Groman and Lynn Alden on the other. But now I want to take it a step further, give you my opinion, and quite frankly, I think that we are all asking the wrong question. Our focus shouldn't really be on the bank reserves and the cash and if they're able to buy bonds or assets with these bank reserves, but more so on understanding the difference between the bank's liabilities, the liabilities in the banking system, the IOUs, and the IOUs on the Fed's balance sheet. Let me explain. It goes back to the main keys that we need to focus on to understand this question, and that's the amount of currency units, how quickly those currency units are circulating, and how many goods and services they're chasing. That's what's going to determine if consumer prices are going up or down. So let's look at 2 balance sheets, the Fed and the commercial banking system. We'll just assume that this balance sheet is an aggregate total of all the balance sheets of all the banks in the real economy. The liability side of the banks are the deposits. Those are actually IOUs to the entities and individuals that hold these accounts, just like businesses and you and I, the average Joe. Your checking account at your bank, whether it's with Wells Fargo, B of A, it doesn't matter. There's nothing in there. Nothing. There's zero. If it was a box and you looked in that box, it would be completely empty. Every single time you get your bank statement or you go to an ATM and it shows you your balance, that isn't how much is in your account. That's how much the bank owes you. So think about that next time you set up a bank account. That bank isn't holding your money. They're taking your money and they're giving you IOUs. So how much do you trust the entity that you're giving your purchasing power to and they're giving you an IOU back? I don't want to go off on that tangent, but it's something to think about. And just like the banking system's liabilities are deposits to everyday people like you and I and businesses, the Fed's liabilities are deposits or IOUs to the banking system. In other words, any of the banks under the Fed's umbrella, like Wells Fargo or B of A, their checking accounts or their deposit accounts, if you want to look at it that way, is with the Fed. So whether they're bank reserves or cash, like we discussed in the last video, they're still liabilities of the Fed. They're still IOUs to the banking system. More on that in just a moment. But there's a big difference between the bank's IOUs to the entities and individuals in the real economy and the Fed's IOUs to the banking system. Remember, it's all about velocity. So let's think this through. These deposits are being spent daily. The individuals and entities are going to Home Depot, Chipotle, the grocery store. They're paying rent. They're buying cars. So it's out there circulating in the economy at a much higher velocity than the liabilities held at the Fed. How many of the banks are going to Chipotle for lunch? How many of the banks are going to Home Depot to buy nails or glue? How many of them are buying new cars? Not many. So again, my point, the takeaway that you have to understand is these liabilities, the deposits in the banking system, are moving at a higher rate of speed. There's higher velocity than the liabilities or the IOUs from the Fed to the banking system. So if we're trying to figure out whether the future is inflationary or deflationary, we have to get hyper-focused on what's happening to the deposits in the banking system. Are they increasing or are they decreasing? And we're going to walk through a bunch of scenarios so you can start thinking about this on your own. But one more thing I want to mention is that the Fed's BS doesn't change. And you could be saying to yourself, well, duh, George, I know that. The Fed's always full of BS. But I'm talking about the size of their balance sheet. It doesn't go up or down. So the IOUs, the deposits held at the Fed, are almost always the same unless the Fed buys or sells assets like treasuries or mortgage-backed sausages. It's very crucial you understand this. So to get your mind around it further, let's go right to the internet. This is from an article entitled Economic Research. Repeat after me. Banks cannot and do not lend out reserves. Okay, and you guys know that from watching my videos, so I'm not going to review that too extensively. But what is helpful is they give us a very simplified central bank balance sheet. On the asset side, you have mortgage-backed securities, treasuries, we talk about those all the time. And then really on the liability side, you just have bank reserves, you have bank notes in circulation, so that's hard currency, and then government deposits. That's the TGA or Treasury General Account. That's the checking account of the Treasury. So there's really only three things that can affect this balance sheet. The central bank increases or decreases its assets. That means buying or selling financial assets like mortgage-backed sausages and treasuries. Number two, the public could decrease or increase the amount of cash, hard currency, banknotes, it wants to hold. So if the public didn't want to hold cash anymore and they gave it all back to the Federal Reserve, since that's an IOU, that's a liability of the Fed, their balance sheet would decrease. If for some reason everyone wants to use cash, which I think would be great, then the Fed would have to create more cash and therefore a liability of the Fed, and that would be an increase to their balance sheet. Number three is the government reduces or increases its deposits at the central bank, which is the TGA that we talked about, because it makes net transfers to or receives net transfers from the private sector. And net transfers, just a fancy way of saying the government is getting money by either taxes or selling treasuries. But I want to point out that although 3 affects the amount of bank reserves in circulation, it does not affect the size of the Fed's balance sheet. So even if the government spends all of the deposits in its account, those deposits don't go away. They just get transferred from the TGA, which is a liability of the Fed, to the banking system or bank reserves or bank cash, which also is a liability of the Fed. Again, the Fed's balance sheet does not change in size. The main takeaway is the only thing that changes the size of the central bank's balance sheet is the central bank themselves selling or buying assets or more or less currency in circulation. So what would happen if money was spent in the economy? If Joe goes to business XYZ and buys $100 worth of stuff, Joe banks at B of A in the business Wells Fargo. The only thing that would happen is the $100 of digital units of measurement that are held on the Fed's balance sheet, the liabilities of the Fed, would go from B of A to Wells Fargo, but the size of the balance sheet wouldn't change. But let's take it a step further. What if taxes are being paid? So Joe owes the government. Your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam owes him $100. The same thing. It's these digital units of measurement would just go from B of A's account, let's say Joe again was banking with B of A, down into the Treasury General. It's just a transfer of 100 units of measurement from here to here. The overall size doesn't change. Now, what if a loan is created? We know that creates additional deposits or additional bank liabilities in the real economy chasing goods and services. But if that happens, if Joe takes out a loan from B of A to buy a house, let's say for $100,000, then if Joe goes and pays the seller, and again, let's say Joe banks with B of A, the seller banks with Wells Fargo, the only thing that would happen on the Fed's balance sheet is a transfer of 100,000 of these digital units of measurement from B of A to Wells Fargo. It's just a transfer, and the overall size in aggregate total remains the exact same. I think you get it. I've beaten the dead horse. So now let's move on to some other examples to where we can get hyper-focused on what's happening right here. What's happening to these IOUs that really determine the future, or if the future is going to be inflationary or deflationary. So what happens when the government spends money? They take taxes out of the system, or they take currency units out of the system when they sell bonds, and then they go ahead and spend that money in other places. Well, we have to start by answering the question, is that a deposit of the Fed, or is it a deposit of the banking system? Because the deposits in the banking system are going to have higher velocity. So if the taxes, let's say, are being paid by Wells Fargo, so they're going to your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, what's happening is that's just on the Fed's balance sheet. It's just going from Wells Fargo to the TGA. But when the government spends the money, most likely they're spending it into the real economy, so that is going to increase the amount of deposits in the commercial banking system. So on net balance, the deposits increase. But what happens if originally the deposits came from the banking system itself? Well, then it's a net wash. Because let's say the $100 that's being paid in taxes are going from these deposits to the government and then just right back to these deposits. You see how that's a net wash, but if the deposits are coming from the Fed, then the increase in deposits in the commercial banking system is a net increase. What about quantitative easing? That's what we talked about in the last video, and it really depends if the Fed is buying the assets from a non-bank, meaning the average Joe or a business, or a bank that has an account with the Federal Reserve. So let's think this one through. So if Wells Fargo has a treasury, the Fed buys the treasury from them, the only thing that happens is there's additional reserves that go into Wells Fargo accounts. So then the size of the Fed's balance sheet would increase, but nothing happens over here. Absolutely nothing, because it's a transaction from a banking entity with the Fed. But if the Fed buys those treasuries from XYZ business, now the Treasury goes from their balance sheet over to the Fed, and the Fed increases the deposits for XYZ business. You see what's happened? In fact, I'll ask you the question, the viewer. What happens to the deposits in the commercial banking system? They increase, right? Because if they're selling a treasury worth $100, let's say, to the Fed, then they have to be compensated somehow. It has to go into their deposit account. So in essence, what they're doing is they're trading treasuries for an increase in their deposit account of $100. So let me say it again just to be very, very clear. If the Fed is doing quantitative easing, with the banking system, it does not affect the deposits in the real economy. If the Fed is doing quantitative easing with entities or individuals, meaning they're buying those assets, mortgage-backed sausages or treasuries, from entities or individuals, then it is increasing the deposits in the commercial banking system or in the real economy, chasing goods and services. And to take a deeper dive into how this works, let's go to the Bank of England's 2014 report on how money is created. The link between QE and quantities of money. QE has a direct effect on the quantities of both base and broad money because of the way in which the bank carries out the asset purchases. And this is key. It's what we just talked about. The policy aims to buy assets, such as government bonds, mainly from non-bank financial companies. So that would be the average Joe or business XYZ on our whiteboard example, such as pension funds or insurance companies. Consider, for example, the purchase of $1 billion in government bonds from a pension fund. The pension fund does not hold reserve accounts with the Bank of England. The commercial bank with whom they hold a bank account is used as an intermediary. The pension fund's bank credits the pension fund's account with $1 billion of deposits. Again, it's an IOU, in exchange for the government bonds. The Bank of England finances its purchases by crediting the reserve to the pension fund's bank. So let's check out this diagram. We've got the balance sheet of the pension fund, the central bank, and the commercial bank involved in the transaction. The government debt starts off as an asset on the pension fund's balance sheet, which they sell to the central bank, so it goes on to their balance sheet as an asset. Then what happens with the commercial bank is the central bank credits their account by an additional $1 billion, so their reserve account grows by $1 billion, and then the commercial bank credits the account of the pension fund by the same $1 billion. So the reserves increase by $1 billion, the deposits increase by $1 billion. The government debt goes from being an asset of the pension fund to an asset of the central bank. But the key here is to notice the deposits in the real economy have increased, but that's because the central bank in this scenario purchased the assets from a non-bank entity. If they would have purchased the assets from the commercial bank themselves, the only thing that would have changed are the amount of reserves. The deposits in the real economy would not have changed at all. And the third thing that really affects the amount of deposits in the real economy chasing goods and services is if a bank buys or sells an asset to a non-bank. So let's think this one through. If Joe wants to buy this treasury that the bank has as an asset, so the bank owns this treasury, they want to sell it to Joe. So Joe gets this treasury. It goes from the balance sheet of the bank onto Joe's balance sheet. But then the deposits would decrease because Joe has to pay for the treasury he just purchased. So the bank's liabilities, their IOUs to Joe, would decrease by the amount of the treasury. Let's say it was $100. So their IOUs to Joe would decrease by $100. They'd owe Joe $100 less than they did before, and their asset would go from their balance sheet to Joe's balance sheet. And the opposite would happen if Joe sells a treasury to a bank. So if Joe has this treasury initially, it would go to the bank's balance sheet, and then the bank would add another deposit for $100, or they would increase their IOUs to Joe by the amount of the treasury. Just as a quick recap, if a bank is selling to a non-bank entity, the amount of deposits in the system decrease. If a bank is buying from a non-bank entity, then the deposits in the system actually increase. And to back this up, let's go right back to the Bank of England. Banks buying and selling government bonds is one particularly important way which the purchase or sale of existing assets by banks creates and destroys money. The deposits we were talking about in the commercial banking system. When banks purchase government bonds from the non-bank private sector, they credit the sellers with bank deposits. So additional deposits have been created. And of course, the opposite happens if the private sector buys government bonds or financial assets from the banks. So if you want to predict the future, to determine what's going to happen with the dollar, the stock market, the bond market, interest rates, gold, real estate, you've got to start by focusing on the commercial bank's deposits. Are they going up or down? That's the only way that you're going to determine if the future is inflationary or deflationary. And if you think you've got your head around how this works, first and foremost, I'd like to congratulate you, but I'd also like to remind you there's one more piece of the puzzle. The majority of the deposits are created or destroyed by debt being increased or decreased in the economy itself. So once you get your head around this, then you have to layer over what's going on here with another cross current, which is even more powerful, and that's how many loans are being created by the banking system, creating additional deposits, additional money supply, chasing goods or services, or how many loans are being paid off by the real economy, decreasing the amount of money that's chasing the same amount of goods and services. I'm sorry, guys. I wish there was an easy way to explain it, but this gets really complicated. I think the easiest takeaway is get your head around this and then try to compartmentalize what's going on here with government spending QE, the banks buying and selling things, and then another completely separate area of focus would be how much debt is being created by the banking system, and then try to come to a conclusion, what's happening on net balance. That's the best advice I can give you. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I'll see you on the next video.